Tywin Lannister had spent nearly 2 decades at the right hand of Aerys Targaryen, and in those years he had seen the great promise of a prince squandered into madness. The Hand had once thought the young king would forge an age of peace and order, but the boy he had guided into manhood had twisted into a paranoid tyrant, drunk on fire and whispers. By the time Aerys was raving about wildfire under the throne and screaming of treachery in every shadow, Tywin understood something clearly. This man would destroy the realm if left unchecked. For years he had endured it, waiting, calculating, hoping that Rhaegar might one day replace his father and steady the kingdom. But Rhaegar remained dutiful, too loyal to a father who deserved no loyalty. Tywin decided the realm could not wait for the slow turning of years. The moment had come for him to act, not as Hand, but as conqueror. The breaking point came during the trial of Rickard and Brandon Stark. Tywin watched the madness of fire consume the court, heard Brandon choking himself to death on a strangling device, while his father burned alive before the throne, and something within him hardened like steel. This was not merely cruelty, it was chaos. Aerys had demanded the heads of Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon next, and he had spoken openly of burning entire houses to ash. That night, Tywin summoned his bannermen to King's Landing under the pretense of reinforcing the Red Keep against rebellion. In truth, he had already begun weaving a quieter conspiracy, one held together not by honor or love, but by gold and the certainty of Lannister vengeance. When his armies arrived, banners blazing red and gold in the capital's streets, the city did not resist. The people of King's Landing had grown tired of fear, tired of the stench of wildfire and whispers of sudden death. To them, Tywin seemed less a usurper and more a deliverer. Within the Red Keep, Sir Jaime Lannister stood uneasy guard beside the throne, torn between his oath to his king and his loyalty to his father. Tywin spared him the choice. He marched into the throne room with his lion-helmed guards, and with a voice like iron, he commanded Aerys to stand down. The king shrieked for wildfire, demanded the city be burned, called his pyromancers forward, but no flames answered him. Tywin had seen to that as well, purging the pyromancers before they could light their jars. Aerys died on the steps of his throne, not by wildfire, but by steel. Some say Jaime struck the blow in a fit of fury, unable to watch his father's honor mocked. Others whispered Tywin himself drove the dagger home, seizing not just the throne, but the act of kingslaying as his own. However it happened, the Mad King's screams were silenced, and for the first time in years, the Red Keep was quiet. Rhaegar was not present. He was in the south, gathering forces against Robert Baratheon. But word reached him within days. His father was dead, and the lions had claimed the Iron Throne. Here the tale might have ended, with Rhaegar returning as king and Tywin restored as his Hand. But Tywin had no intention of bending knee again. When the court asked who would rule, the Lord of Casterly Rock did not hesitate. "The realm needs strength, not madness," he said, his voice echoing against the stones. "It is Lannister gold that fills your purses, Lannister steel that keeps your streets safe, and Lannister will that delivers you from fire. The Iron Throne is mine, by right of conquest and necessity." And so the lion roared, not as servant but as king. Not all lords accepted this at once. The Starks and Baratheons whispered of rebellion, the Arryns of broken oaths. Yet few could deny Tywin's power. The crown's debts, once swollen, vanished overnight when the new king forgave them. Merchants cheered as the flow of gold returned. Soldiers swore fealty when their purses were filled, and the common folk, weary of fire and madness, lowered their heads and accepted their new master. Tywin's banners replaced the dragon on the throne, red and gold, supplanting black and red. Cersei stood at his side, eyes glittering with triumph, already imagining herself queen beside some unfortunate match her father would choose for her. But shadows stretched long over the new reign. Across the Riverlands, Robert Baratheon called him a usurper, little better than Aerys. Ned Stark wrestled with honor and oath. unwilling to bow to a man who had murdered his king, even if that king had been a tyrant. And somewhere in the Stormlands, Lyanna Stark lay hidden, her fate ready to ignite the realm once more. Tywin Lannister had taken the throne, but holding it would demand a cruelty even greater than that of the dragon he had slain. When word of Aerys' death reached Rhaegar at Harrenhal, he sat in silence for a long time, the weight of it sinking deeper than the armor he wore. He had prepared to overthrow his father in his own way, to step into power and bring peace after years of chaos. But now the throne was gone. Not to him, not to the Targaryens at all, but to the Lion of the West. Tywin Lannister had crowned himself with blood and fire extinguished, and the songs that should have been sung of Rhaegar's return would instead be written for a Lannister victory. His men watched him carefully, waiting for the Silver Prince to call them to war. He did not. Rhaegar was a dreamer, not a butcher, and though he whispered of prophecy and the child he had conceived with Lyanna Stark, his heart faltered at the thought of plunging the realm into greater bloodshed. His hesitation, however noble, would cost him everything. Robert Baratheon, by contrast, wasted no time in rage. To him, Aerys' death was no triumph but a theft. He had raised his banners for vengeance and freedom. Not so a cold and calculating lion could sit where the dragon once burned. "Usurper!" he thundered in Storm's End, his hammer raised high. "First the dragon stole our lives, now the lion steals our crown. Let Westeros see who is fit to rule." His words burned like wildfire in the hearts of his bannermen. And though some wavered at the thought of facing the richest and most disciplined armies in the realm, Robert's fury was enough to keep them loyal. With Jon Arryn at his side and Ned Stark bound by blood and duty, Robert prepared to march not only against Targaryen tyranny, but now against Lannister usurpation. In the Eyrie, Lord Jon Arryn brooded over the turn of events. He had rebelled for honor and the safety of his wards, not for ambition, yet ambition was what Tywin represented most clearly. Tywin's rule might bring stability, true, but Arryn knew better than to trust the Lion's mercy. He whispered often to Ned of loyalty, of the oaths they had sworn to defend the realm, but Ned Stark's silence told him more than words could. Ned had lost his father and brother to Aerys' cruelty. To bend the knee to Tywin now, to the man who had betrayed his king and claimed the throne for himself, was a dishonor too bitter to swallow. The wolf's loyalty shifted to the stag, not because Robert's cause was certain, but because Ned could not stomach serving another tyrant in golden robes. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Tywin wasted no time shaping his reign. He was not a man of ceremony or song, and his coronation was swift, practical, and entirely absent of spectacle. The Iron Throne no longer bore the scent of dragonfire or madness, but it radiated cold authority under the Lion's hand. His first decrees cut through the rot of the realm. Debts cancelled, taxes reorganized, the city watch doubled in size and discipline. Merchants prospered again, trade routes reopened, and the common folk who had once lived in fear of Aerys' wild moods found life under Tywin bearable, even predictable. Fear of punishment kept order, but it was an order the people had long craved. Cersei basked in the splendor of her father's triumph. No longer just the daughter of the Warden of the West, she now stood as the princess of a new dynasty, certain that her beauty and wit would soon secure her a crown of her own. Tywin, always the master of marriage, began plotting matches before his throne was warm. If Rhaegar lived, Cersei would be his queen, a lioness beside the Silver Prince. If Robert survived, she might be bound to him to end the rebellion, turning his hammer into a tool for Lannister power. And if both fell, well, Viserys remained, a boy who could be molded or crushed if need be. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered. The banners of the stag, wolf, and falcon did not bow to the lion's roar. Rhaegar's loyalists whispered that Tywin had murdered not only a king, but the line of prophecy itself. Robert's soldiers marched with fury that could not be bought by gold. The Starks remembered too keenly the screams of Rickard and Brandon, and to see a Lannister on the throne only sharpened the old wound. Tywin had taken the Iron Throne with cold precision, but the realm he meant to rule as his own was already splitting in half. The first cracks showed in the Riverlands, where lords loyal to both Stark and Arryn began to gather men, testing Tywin's strength. Raventree and Riverrun stirred, their loyalty uncertain. Tywin, of course, knew rebellion when he smelled it. The lion had not risen to power through patience or forgiveness, and he was not about to let wolves and stags tear at his rule. He began sending ravens, summoning gold and steel from the west, calling his bannermen to prepare for a war that might dwarf the one he had just ended. For Tywin, ruling was never about peace, it was about control. And as he looked down from the Iron Throne upon the realm that was now his, he understood what others could not. This was only the beginning. The first war banners rose in the Stormlands, their colors bright against the gray skies of autumn. Robert Baratheon rode at the head of his men, the warhammer he had wielded at Summerhall resting heavy across his saddle. To his followers, he was not just a lord, but the last true hope of the realm, the man who would break both dragon and lion. His hatred for Aerys had been a fire, but his hatred for Tywin was something colder, heavier, forged by the theft of a crown he had already bled for. He swore that no Lannister would ever sit the Iron Throne while he drew breath, and those words were carried from campfire to campfire, rallying even the uncertain to his cause. Ned Stark rode beside him, quieter but no less determined. For him, the war was not about crowns or claims. It was about justice, about the screams of his father and brother that still haunted his nights. Tywin Lannister might claim order and stability, but to Ned, he was nothing more than another tyrant who had risen on the corpses of better men. His sense of honor could not allow silence. He had sworn an oath to protect the realm, and though breaking it meant war, he believed breaking it was the only honorable path left. Jon Arryn, older and more cautious, tried to temper them both, urging patience and strategy, but he too had cast his lot. The Falcon of the Vale would not bow to the Lion of the Rock. In King's Landing, Tywin moved with the precision of a man who had waited decades for such a moment. He had gold, he had men, and above all, he had no illusions about mercy. His orders were swift and uncompromising. The Riverlands, always the fulcrum of war, became his first target. He sent ravens to Riverrun demanding Hoster Tully's fealty, reminding him that debts to the crown could be erased with loyalty or doubled with rebellion. Hoster hesitated, his lands already split between sons who favored Robert and those who feared Tywin's wrath. That hesitation would soon cost him dearly. Tywin's bannermen poured into the Riverlands, their armor gleaming, their discipline unmatched. Villages that wavered burned. Lords who resisted were hanged on their own gates. Where the Targaryens had ruled through fire and madness, Tywin ruled through fear and gold, and the realm quickly learned which was the stronger chain. Rhaegar's position became the most precarious. He had dreamed of ending his father's tyranny, and now found himself stripped of both his crown and his cause. Some urged him to join Robert, to turn against Tywin and fight for the honor of his house. But Rhaegar was torn between prophecy and reality. He thought often of Lyanna, hidden in the Tower of Joy, and the child she carried, a child he believed would fulfill the prophecy of the promised prince. That child's future depended on stability, not endless war. So he chose silence, pulling his forces back and waiting to see which way the storm would break. To many of his supporters, that hesitation was betrayal. Men who had once sworn to the dragon now swore to the stag. And Robert's host swelled with deserters who sought a leader unafraid to act. For the first time in memory, the great houses of Westeros stood not between dragon and rebellion, but between lion and stag. The North, the Vale, and the Stormlands declared openly for Robert. The Westerlands, of course, stood with Tywin, and the Reach, ever cautious, leaned toward him as well, enticed by promises of marriages and the promise of stability. The Riverlands and Crownlands became the battleground, torn between loyalty and defiance. It was a war of position as much as swords, and Tywin, the greatest general of his age, meant to crush Robert before his fury could turn into legend. The first clash came on the banks of the Blackwater Rush. where Lannister Goldcloaks met Robert's vanguard in a storm of steel. Robert's hammer crushed men and horses alike, his roars carrying over the din, and the men of the Stormlands fought with a ferocity born of vengeance. Yet for every man Robert felled, 2 more Lannisters stood in place, their lines unbroken, their banners unyielding. By the end of the day, the river ran red, and though Robert held the field, it was a hollow victory. He had bloodied the lion, but he had not broken it, and his men knew that Tywin himself had not yet entered the fight. In the Red Keep, Tywin sat upon the Iron Throne, listening to reports of the battle with a face carved from stone. He did not rage at the losses. He did not gloat at Robert's exhaustion. He simply listened, calculating each detail, another piece of the war he intended to win. "The stag runs strong," he murmured at last. "But even the strongest beast can be broken with patience and precision." Then he dismissed his council and began drafting letters, the kind of letters that bound marriages, debts, and loyalties tighter than any chain of iron. War would decide the realm, yes, but Tywin knew that war was fought as much with parchment as with swords. Yet beneath his calm, the lion understood something dangerous. Robert's fury could not be bought. Ned Stark's honor could not be bent, and Jon Arryn's resolve could not be ignored. For all his power, Tywin Lannister had not crushed rebellion. He had merely given it a new face. And in the north and south alike, men were whispering a dangerous question. Was Robert Baratheon the true King Westeros had been waiting for all along? Winter's chill began to creep into the Riverlands as the war dragged on, and with it came the true weight of Tywin's strategy. The early skirmishes had bloodied Robert's rebellion, but had not broken it, and Tywin knew well that brute force alone would not win him the throne for good. He had not built the Lannister name on battlefields alone, but on the web of gold and alliances that stretched across Westeros like an invisible net. Now seated upon the Iron Throne, he cast that net wide, determined to strangle Robert not only with steel, but with oaths and marriages. The first letters went to the Reach, where the Tyrells had long been careful to serve whichever master seemed strongest. Mace Tyrell was no great strategist, but he was vain, hungry for recognition, and eager to see his house rise beyond the shadow of the Targaryens. Tywin promised him titles, lands, and the marriage of his daughter Margaery one day to a Lannister heir. It was a promise sweet enough to bind the Reach to his cause. The granaries of the south opened for his armies, and with grain came strength. While Robert's men tightened their belts and gnawed on bitter rations, the lions feasted and kept their soldiers loyal. Next, Tywin turned his eye to Dorne. The Martells had lost much under Aerys, and Rhaegar's union with Elia still stung like an old wound. But Tywin did not waste his time begging for Dornish loyalty, nor did he flatter them with empty words. He offered blood. Letters were sent promising vengeance for every Dornish slight suffered under Aerys, vengeance he swore to deliver upon Robert and his rebel allies. Whether true or not mattered little. Tywin's words were sharp enough to keep Dorne silent, and silence from the south was all he required. Robert, meanwhile, pressed northward into the Riverlands, drawing support from House Tully at last. Hoster Tully had hesitated too long, and when his lands burned under Lannister swords, he bent to Robert, offering the hands of his daughters in marriage to strengthen the rebel cause. Ned Stark wed Catelyn, sealing the bond of wolf and trout, while Robert swore himself to wed Lisa once the war was won. These matches filled the rebel camps with cheer and resolve, for it seemed to many that the old houses were rising together against the golden usurper. But Tywin, when the news reached him, only smirked faintly. Marriage might strengthen loyalty, but it also created weaknesses. Bonds of family could be severed with fire and steel, and Tywin had no hesitation in wielding both. The war shifted sharply when Tywin himself took the field. His armies were vast, disciplined, and richer than any other host in Westeros. He marched first against River Run, intent on cutting out the heart of the Riverlands and choking Robert's rebellion before it could spread further. Jaime rode beside him, golden and proud, the Kingslayer reborn as the prince of a new dynasty. Gregor Clegane thundered at the head of a vanguard, his brutality unleashed upon villages that whispered Robert's name too loudly. Where Robert inspired with fury, Tywin crushed with terror, leaving behind ashes and corpses as a warning of what defiance brought. Robert met him near the Trident, the same river where, in another tale, the Dragon Prince would have fallen. But this time it was lion against stag, and the battle that followed shook the realm. Robert fought at the center, hammer rising and falling like the storm that birthed him, his men surging with his every roar. Tywin commanded from the rear, his lines unyielding, his tactics precise. For hours the two forces clashed, and though Robert broke lines again and again with sheer ferocity, the discipline of the Lannisters closed each wound as swiftly as it opened. By nightfall, the field belonged to neither side, littered with corpses of lion and stag alike. The stalemate bred whispers. In the rebel camps, men muttered that Robert's fury could not overcome Tywin's gold. In the lion's den, soldiers grumbled that Robert's strength was unnatural, that no man should stand so long against so many. The war had become more than a struggle for a throne. It was a contest between two visions of rule, one built on love, loyalty and vengeance, the other on fear, order, and cold precision. And in the quiet halls of the Red Keep, Cersei dreamed of the crown she believed was already hers. She spoke of it often, in whispers that crept into the ears of courtiers. She would not be content to remain only her father's daughter. She wanted to be queen, to sit beside a king and wield the power her father used so coldly. Tywin, who had no patience for dreams, reminded her often that the game was not yet won. But even he could not deny the ambition smoldering in his daughter's green eyes. Ambition that might one day burn hotter than any wildfire. For now, the war dragged on, each side refusing to break, each waiting for the other to stumble. Yet beneath the clash of swords and the weight of banners, the realm itself began to fracture. Small folk cursed both lion and stag, weary of blood and fire. Lords plotted quietly in their halls, hedging loyalties in case of sudden turns. And somewhere far to the south, Lyanna Stark, hidden in her tower of whispers, brought forth the child of prophecy, his cries unheard by the men who bled for crowns. Winter's chill began to creep into the riverlands as the war dragged on, and with it came the true weight of Tywin's strategy. The early skirmishes had bloodied Robert's rebellion, but had not broken it, and Tywin knew well that brute force alone would not win him the throne for good. He had not built the Lannister name on battlefields alone, but on the web of gold and alliances that stretched across Westeros like an invisible net. Now seated upon the Iron Throne, he cast that net wide, determined to strangle Robert not only with steel, but with oaths and marriages. The first letters went to the Reach, where the Tyrells had long been careful to serve whichever master seemed strongest. Mace Tyrell was no great strategist, but he was vain, hungry for recognition, and eager to see his house rise beyond the shadow of the Targaryens. Tywin promised him titles, lands, and the marriage of his daughter Margaery one day to a Lannister heir. It was a promise sweet enough to bind the Reach to his cause. The granaries of the south opened for his armies, and with grain came strength. While Robert's men tightened their belts and gnawed on bitter rations, the lions feasted and kept their soldiers loyal. Next, Tywin turned his eye to Dorne. The Martells had lost much under Aerys, and Rhaegar's union with Elia still stung like an old wound. But Tywin did not waste his time begging for Dornish loyalty, nor did he flatter them with empty words. He offered blood. Letters were sent promising vengeance for every Dornish slight suffered under Aerys, vengeance he swore to deliver upon Robert and his rebel allies. Whether true or not mattered little. Tywin's words were sharp enough to keep Dorne silent, and silence from the south was all he required. Robert, meanwhile, pressed northward into the Riverlands, drawing support from House Tully at last. Hoster Tully had hesitated too long, and when his lands burned under Lannister swords, he bent to Robert, offering the hands of his daughters in marriage to strengthen the rebel cause. Ned Stark wed Catelyn, sealing the bond of wolf and trout, while Robert swore himself to wed Lisa once the war was won. These matches filled the rebel camps with cheer and resolve, for it seemed to many that the old houses were rising together against the golden usurper. But Tywin, when the news reached him, only smirked faintly. Marriage might strengthen loyalty, but it also created weaknesses. Bonds of family could be severed with fire and steel, and Tywin had no hesitation in wielding both. The war shifted sharply when Tywin himself took the field. His armies were vast, disciplined, and richer than any other host in Westeros. He marched first against River Run, intent on cutting out the heart of the Riverlands and choking Robert's rebellion before it could spread further. Jaime rode beside him, golden and proud, the Kingslayer reborn as the prince of a new dynasty. Gregor Clegane thundered at the head of a vanguard, his brutality unleashed upon villages that whispered Robert's name too loudly. Where Robert inspired with fury, Tywin crushed with terror, leaving behind ashes and corpses as a warning of what defiance brought. Robert met him near the Trident, the same river where, in another tale, the Dragon Prince would have fallen. But this time it was lion against stag, and the battle that followed shook the realm. Robert fought at the center, hammer rising and falling like the storm that birthed him, his men surging with his every roar. Tywin commanded from the rear, his lines unyielding, his tactics precise. For hours the two forces clashed, and though Robert broke lines again and again, with sheer ferocity, the discipline of the Lannisters closed each wound as swiftly as it opened. By nightfall, the field belonged to neither side, littered with corpses of lion and stag alike. The stalemate bred whispers. In the rebel camps, men muttered that Robert's fury could not overcome Tywin's gold. In the lion's den, soldiers grumbled that Robert's strength was unnatural, that no man should stand so long against so many. The war had become more than a struggle for a throne. It was a contest between two visions of rule, one built on love, loyalty and vengeance, the other on fear, order, and cold precision. And in the quiet halls of the Red Keep, Cersei dreamed of the crown she believed was already hers. She spoke of it often, in whispers that crept into the ears of courtiers. She would not be content to remain only her father's daughter. She wanted to be queen, to sit beside a king and wield the power her father used so coldly. Tywin, who had no patience for dreams, reminded her often that the game was not yet won. But even he could not deny the ambition smoldering in his daughter's green eyes. Ambition that might one day burn hotter than any wildfire. For now, the war dragged on, each side refusing to break, each waiting for the other to stumble. Yet beneath the clash of swords and the weight of banners, the realm itself began to fracture. Small folk cursed both lion and stag, weary of blood and fire. Lords plotted quietly in their halls, hedging loyalties in case of sudden turns. And somewhere far to the south, Lyanna Stark, hidden in her Tower of Whispers, brought forth the child of prophecy, his cries unheard by the men who bled for crowns. The war dragged into its second year, and though both lion and stag stood bloodied, neither had yet fallen. The Riverlands had become a wasteland of ashes and corpses, burned again and again as armies clashed and withdrew. Crops rotted in the fields, villages lay abandoned, and the Trident ran dark with blood so often that mothers warned their children not to drink from it. In the north, lords whispered of sending more men, but the long march south drained their strength, and Ned Stark's bannermen began to question how much more they could sacrifice for a cause that seemed endless. Even the most loyal to Robert began to wonder if Tywin's cold order might be better than eternal war. Tywin himself felt the weight of the conflict, though he showed none of it in his face. Each night his scribes carried stacks of ravens across the realm, messages filled with promises of gold, titles, or vengeance. He knew that men were cheaper to buy than to bleed, and where Robert fought with his hammer, Tywin fought with ink and seal. One by one, minor lords bent to his side, not out of loyalty, but out of fear or greed. It was not enough to win the war outright, but it tightened the noose. Robert, for all his courage, had no coin to buy loyalties. He could only inspire men to fight, and inspiration alone could not feed them. The first great crack appeared in the Vale. Jon Arryn had long been the steady hand of the rebellion, but whispers of Tywin's offers reached his bannermen. Promises of marriage for his heir, promises of gold to rebuild the Vale's castles, promises of peace for a people already weary. Jon resisted them with all the honor he could summon, but even he felt the temptation when he saw Robert's soldiers starving, their faces gaunt and their morale fraying. Honor was a fine shield, but Tywin had learned long ago that hunger pierced deeper than any sword. At Riverrun, Hoster Tully's halls echoed with the sound of debate. His daughters had bound his house to the rebels, yet Tywin's armies had burned his lands to cinders, and no relief had come. When envoys from the Rock arrived with offers of pardon and restoration of his lands, Hoster wavered. His sons raged, but he was an old man tired of war, and Tywin's hand seemed more certain than Robert's desperate hammer. The rebellion was no longer a cause of honor, it was a question of survival, and survival often chose the side of the lion. Robert himself seemed blind to these fractures. His fury burned as hot as ever, and in battle he was still a god among men, crushing foes with his hammer, rallying soldiers with a roar. Yet outside the field he was no ruler. He drank too heavily, laughed too loudly, and ignored the politics that stitched wars together. He left those burdens to Jon and Ned, but their voices could not drown out the growing doubts. Robert believed that if he slew Tywin on the battlefield, the war would end. Tywin knew better. Wars were not ended with a single blow, but with patience, gold, and the slow strangling of hope. In King's Landing, the court began to shift around the new order. Tywin's decrees kept the city fed and safe, and though the small folk muttered about taxes and harsh punishments, they preferred his rule to the terror of Aerys. Cersei grew into her role as the jewel of the court, courted by lords and envied by ladies. She dreamed not of rebellion, but of crowns, pressing her father to arrange a match that would secure the dynasty he had carved. Tywin, ever cautious, kept her unwed, saving her as a piece for the right moment. Yet her impatience grew, and with it, her resentment. She wanted power now, not in some distant scheme, and those who underestimated her hunger would one day regret it. Beyond all this, hidden from the songs and banners, Lyanna Stark remained in her tower, her child swaddled in silence. The boy's dark hair and grey eyes marked him clearly as Stark, though in his blood ran dragon's fire. Rhaegar's dream of prophecy lived in the infant's cries, but no prophecy could sway the war raging across Westeros. As Tywin and Robert bled the realm dry, the boy remained unseen, a secret that might have changed everything, yet changed nothing in the moment. The balance of war tilted ever so slightly toward the lion. Not in battles, for Robert still shattered every line he met, but in the quiet halls where lords chose their survival. And though Robert still roared of victory, though Ned still swore oaths of honor, though Jon still counseled patience, the truth lay heavy over all their banners. Tywin Lannister had not won yet, but he was teaching the realm to live with him as king. And once men learned to live with a tyrant, it was harder still to tear him down. By the third year of war, the cracks within Robert's rebellion had widened into dangerous fractures. The Riverlands, scorched and starving, no longer cheered when Robert's host passed through. Instead, doors were barred, fields lay empty, and more than once rebels found villages that had already bent the knee to Tywin's envoys. Fear of the lion spread faster than loyalty to the stag. Robert raged when he heard of these betrayals, smashing goblets against stone and swearing vengeance, but rage could not fill granaries or rebuild burned keeps. The further his armies marched, the weaker his cause seemed to grow, not because he lacked courage, but because the realm had grown tired of bleeding for kings it did not yet have. Ned Stark carried the burden of these truths more heavily than Robert would admit. He saw the gaunt faces of his men, the bitterness of the river lords, and the hesitation in Jon Arryn's eyes. He knew that Robert's dream of a swift victory had rotted into a war of attrition, and wars of attrition favored the rich, not the righteous. His heart remained unbending, But even his loyalty could not blind him to the danger of collapse. Each raven that arrived from the north reminded him of Winterfell's distance, of the men left behind to defend their own lands, of the cost his people paid for his honor. Tywin, meanwhile, pressed his advantage with a patience that unnerved his enemies. He did not hurl his forces recklessly at Robert's host, but bled him in small strikes, burning supply lines, ambushing foragers, forcing Robert's army to live off scraps while the lions feasted from the granaries of the Reach. He promised pardon to any lord who bent the knee, and one by one those lords began to yield. When word spread that House Frey had opened the twins to Lannister envoys, it struck like a hammer blow to Robert's cause. The Freys had always been cautious, but their shifting loyalties meant that the rebel host could no longer move freely. The Trident, once a river of hope, became a cage. The betrayal that cut deepest came not from the Riverlands, but from the Vale. After months of famine and quiet pressure, a faction of Arryn bannermen declared openly for Tywin, claiming that the Lion offered peace, while Robert offered only endless blood. Jon Arryn remained loyal, but his authority was challenged, and he was forced to spend more time holding his own bannermen in line than striking at Tywin's armies. The rebellion, once a united front, now sagged under the weight of doubt and division. Robert roared at the treachery, but even his most loyal lords whispered that perhaps Tywin was inevitable. The stalemate broke at last, near Stony Sept. Robert, driven by desperation and fury, led his men into the town, hoping to force a decisive battle that would end the war. Tywin, always watchful, had laid the trap. His forces surrounded the town in silence, cutting off every road, every gate, every escape. When Robert realized the noose had tightened, he laughed, a wild sound that echoed through the streets. "Then we'll break their lines and feast on their corpses." He bellowed, and his men cheered, but in their hearts many knew the truth. They were cornered, and the lion was closing his jaws. The fighting in Stony Sept was unlike any battle before it. It was not open field, but streets and alleys, fire and smoke. Robert fought like a demon, hammer-crushing skulls, his body bloodied and battered yet unyielding. Ned fought at his side, his sword flashing through the chaos, while Jon Arryn tried desperately to hold the lines. But for every rebel that stood, 2 lions pressed forward, and the streets grew slick with gore. By the 3rd day, the rebels were driven into the square, their dead piled high around them. Robert still roared, but his voice was hoarse, and even he could feel the weight of defeat pressing down. When Tywin himself entered the square, the fighting halted as though time itself had paused. He did not wear the wild grin of Robert, nor the dreamer's sadness of Rhaegar. His face was stone, his eyes cold, his armor gleaming like molten gold in the sun. He raised a hand, and the lions lowered their swords. Robert stood, chest heaving, hammer in hand, defiance blazing in his eyes. For a moment, it seemed the 2 men might clash then and there, a final hammer against the lion's steel. But Tywin did not move. He only spoke, his voice calm, steady, and merciless. "The war is over," he said. "Kneel or die." Robert spat blood onto the stones. "Better to die a free man than live as your dog." His voice carried ragged but proud, and his men answered with weary cheers. But Tywin did not argue. He gave the signal, and the square erupted in steel once more. The slaughter at Stony Sept ended with the streets awash in red. And though Robert Baratheon fought like a storm until his last breath, even storms must break upon rock. Surrounded on all sides, his hammer slick with blood, he faced Tywin's soldiers with a grin that bordered on madness. When at last he fell, it was not from fear or surrender, but from sheer exhaustion. His body pierced by a dozen spears, yet refusing to drop until strength deserted him. His men tried to rally, but without the stag's roar, their courage crumbled. Some fled, some threw down their arms, and others were cut down where they stood. The rebellion that had begun with fire and fury ended in silence, broken only by the crackle of burning houses and the cries of the dying. Ned Stark was captured in the chaos, dragged before Tywin in chains, his face grim but unbowed. Jon Arryn too was taken, older and wearier, his eyes heavy with defeat. Tywin regarded them as one might regard troublesome dogs, dangerous but not worth killing without thought. To execute them outright would risk making martyrs of their names, martyrs who might inspire another rebellion. Instead, Tywin chose a subtler cruelty. Ned was sent back to the north, stripped of honors, forbidden to raise banners without the king's leave, his father's sword confiscated as a token of submission. Jon Arryn was kept in the capital, paraded not as a prisoner but as a humbled lord, forced to serve in the new king's council as a reminder that even the proudest falcons could be caged. The Riverlands bore the harshest punishment. River Run was seized, its halls occupied by Lannister bannermen, and Hoster Tully was left to die slowly in his own chambers, his lands reduced to ash. The smaller houses, who had bent the knee too late, were stripped of titles and given over to men more loyal to the Lion. The Trident, once the heart of rebellion, was transformed into a scarred wasteland, a permanent warning etched into the soil. Defiance against House Lannister would end in ruin. Back in King's Landing, Tywin consolidated his victory with the same cold efficiency he had shown on the battlefield. Gold flowed freely again. The Reach sent its grain, and the city's markets bustled under the heavy presence of Lannister guards. The Iron Throne no longer smelled of wildfire or echoed with a mad king's rants. Instead, it loomed as a symbol of unyielding order. Those who sought favor bent quickly, for Tywin rewarded loyalty as surely as he punished defiance. Yet beneath the veneer of stability, fear rooted itself deep. The people no longer spoke of kings with reverence or love, but with caution, for in this new reign words carried weight, and whispers could bring the noose. Cersei, ever restless, demanded her place in the game. Her father, after long hesitation, began arranging her marriage to secure alliances. Suitors from the Reach, from the Stormlands, and even whispers of a Dornish match came before the council. Cersei dreamed of crowns and queenship, but Tywin's caution kept her fate in his hands, and she resented every moment of it. Jaime, meanwhile, remained the golden sword at his father's side, his reputation as the Kingslayer both feared and despised. Though some lords sneered behind his back, no one dared challenge the prince of the new dynasty while Tywin's shadow loomed. Far away, in the Tower of Joy, Lyanna Stark's health withered. The war that should have freed her had ended instead, with her brothers broken and Robert dead. She clutched her newborn son with fading strength, whispering names and prophecies to the boy as if he might carry the hope of all the world upon his small shoulders. But when she died, as she always must, the child passed quietly into the hands of those sworn to silence. The boy's blood carried both wolf and dragon, but in a realm ruled by lions, he was nothing more than a hidden ember, flickering unseen in the dark. Tywin's reign now seemed unassailable. The Baratheons lay shattered, their lord dead, their house broken. The Starks nursed their wounds in the far north, bound in chains of honor they dared not break. The Arryns were cowed, the Tullys ruined, the Martells silent, and the Tyrells eager for scraps from the Lion's table. For the first time in years, the realm lay quiet, not in peace, but in submission. And Tywin, seated on the Iron Throne, ruled not with dreams or madness, but with the heavy, suffocating weight of inevitability. Yet in the stillness of victory, shadows lengthened. Fear held the realm together, but fear alone could not erase hatred. Songs of Robert's last stand spread from tavern to tavern, tales of the stag who fought until he could no longer stand, of the wolf who would not bow, of the falcon who endured in silence. Men told these stories in whispers, but they told them all the same, and from whispers rebellions were born. Tywin had crushed the rebellion with steel, but the memory of defiance smoldered like hidden coals, waiting only for the wind, waiting only for the wind. Years passed beneath the shadow of the Lion, and the realm learned to live under Tywin Lannister's cold rule. The Iron Throne no longer shook with the laughter of a mad king, nor did it tremble with the songs of a gallant prince. Instead, it became the seat of order, gold, and silence. The merchants of King's Landing prospered, trade routes grew secure, and the coffers of the crown swelled with coin. Yet for every merchant who smiled, there was a peasant who wept. For Tywin's taxes were heavy, his punishment swift, and his justice merciless. He brought stability, yes, but it was the stability of chains. The great houses bent the knee in turn, not because they loved him, but because they feared what defiance would bring. The north remained cold and distant. Ned Stark ruling quietly from Winterfell, his heart still scarred by the loss of his family and the memory of Robert's fall. He sent no rebellion, but his letters to King's Landing grew shorter and fewer each year. The Vale, bound by Jon Arryn's enforced loyalty, sat uneasily under Lannister oversight, its falcons caged but never tamed. The Riverlands, stripped of their pride, became little more than hunting grounds for Lannister soldiers. The Reach prospered under Tywin's favor, but Mace Tyrell's boasts were drowned out by the lion's roar. And Dorne, though silent, remembered Ilya, remembered the blood of their princess, and waited with patient hatred for the day vengeance could be taken. Cersei grew restless as the years wore on. Married at last to secure a political alliance, she found no joy in her husband, no satisfaction in the role her father had carved for her. She longed to be more than a piece in Tywin's game, to wield power for herself, and her resentment grew in secret. Jaime remained at his father's side, the golden sword of the dynasty, admired and despised in equal measure, his honor forever stained by the title of Kingslayer. Together they were the faces of the new order, but neither shone with love from the realm. They were feared, tolerated, whispered about, but never adored. In the taverns and villages, the songs of Robert Baratheon lingered. They told of the stag who fought to the last breath, of the hammer that broke armies, of the man who died defiant before the lion's jaws. They told, too, of the wolf who endured in silence, and of the falcon who bore the weight of chains with dignity. These were not open rebellions, but memories that refused to die, and memories were often more dangerous than swords. The people did not dream of Tywin. They endured him, waiting for another hero to rise. Far away, the hidden child of Lyanna Stark grew in secrecy, raised without name or crown, but with blood that tied together the threads of prophecy. His existence remained unknown to the king, yet if discovered, he would have been a threat to all Tywin had built. The boy's cries, unheard by lords and kings, were the quiet promise that history was not finished, that prophecy was not so easily crushed by fear and steel. But in Tywin's reign, that child's story was little more than a whisper against the roar of the lion. Tywin himself aged as the throne aged with him. His victories remained unchallenged, his order unbroken, but the years weighed heavily even upon a lion. He ruled until his hair turned white and his back bent, yet still he held the throne, refusing to relinquish power, refusing to admit that even lions must die. He left behind no songs of love, no legends of heroism, no legacy of warmth. He left instead silence, discipline and fear, a realm held together by iron threads that would snap the moment his hand released them. When he finally passed, the bells of King's Landing tolled not with mourning, but with relief. Lords came to the capital not to weep, but to weigh their chances, to measure the strength of his heirs, to see if the lion's cubs could rule as their sire had. The dynasty he had carved seemed mighty, but without his cold will, cracks spread quickly, and whispers of rebellion returned. The legacy of Tywin Lannister was not peace, nor greatness, but a pause in chaos. A kingdom ruled by fear that waited only for his death to breathe again. And so, though he had stolen the throne and crushed rebellion, though he had reigned with strength unmatched by kings before him, the realm remembered him not as savior, nor even as true king. It remembered him as the lion who ruled with iron claws, and whose silence smothered the realm until even silence could not endure. His reign ended not with fire nor song, but with the slow unraveling of a kingdom that had never loved him, only obeyed him. And in that unraveling, the seeds of new wars were already taking root.